Okay, folks, hope everybody is doing well here. And what we're going to talk about today, first, let's take a look at the screen here. If I share the screen with you and let you see what I see. And you should see my screen there. So what you see on the screen is our schedule. And here we are on 4/22, discussion 3 posted, which I will have posted after I'm done recording this video. I'll go ahead and post the discussion based on this video. And you can see on the 27th here, we have a quiz coming up. And your quiz will just involve this material here. So animal rights, chapters 15 through 17, assisted suicide, which is my talk right now, 37 through 38. And then a bit of Sandel, chapter 10, which I'll explain when we get there. I'm not even sure I have a PowerPoint. I might just send a Sandel video for that. We'll have to see. But here's my video discussion on assisted suicide. So if you go to your WordPress site, you will see a bit here called assisted death. Just going to make sure that you're seeing the right thing. And it looks like you are, but I'm going to start a new share just in case. So assisted death is our PowerPoint. I'm going to pull it up here and just kind of go over some of the main arguments and some of the main points. It's an issue you know a lot about, so I don't have to talk that long. I don't have to keep this in great detail on this. If I just give you the main points and the main arguments and then send you a couple other videos along with this one, you'll probably be in a great position. So just about to open up here and we'll take a look at it. So first, a word of caution on the subject. When we're talking about assisted death, typically what we're talking about here is terminally ill patients who, you can see my PowerPoint's emerging there, terminally ill patients that want to take their own lives. They don't want to suffer to the end. And when I say terminally ill, I mean they're going to die in a matter of months. That's typically who we're talking about. This is a very delicate issue for a number of reasons. Some people have passionate personal feelings on this. Probably we all have passionate personal feelings on this matter. Okay, but apart from our personal feelings, some people have religious beliefs. It's a difficult and very you have to deal with this issue very carefully. It's an extremely difficult issue to keep into focus here. So let's try carefully. I'm going to go over the PowerPoint with you, some main points. I'll send a couple of other videos so that are even shorter than this one, which is going to be fairly short, I think. So you'll have a good arsenal to go through it, and the videos will all be important to your discussion. So, all right, let's go ahead and get to our PowerPoint. I'll share my screen again and make sure that we're sharing the right thing here. So there's the screen, or it should be. And just got to get to where the slideshow shows from our current slide. There we go. And you'll still see me. I'll move myself around as needed to get out of your way. So sometimes this whole issue is described as euthanasia. See the word right there, euthanasia. That is sometimes used in a special sense. And I'll explain that later. Sometimes assisted death is distinguished from euthanasia, but broadly speaking, euthanasia is the term for the whole discussion. And it comes from two Greek words, eu, which means good, and thanatos, which means death. So it means a good death. And the Greek idea is that you'll go out on your own terms by your own free will. And Greeks and Romans were able to do this. There were doctors that permitted it and so forth. So it did happen. Now, again, at the bottom here, you can see some use the term euthanasia in a more restrictive sense to mean the doctor actually kills the patient, presumably here at the patient's request, and assisted death to be the term used to mean the doctor just gives the patient a prescription and she kills herself, he kills himself, the patient kills themselves. So some people make a distinction between the terms euthanasia and assisted death, and some people use the term euthanasia for the whole thing. All right. So first, just a couple of distinctions to keep in mind, and I'm going to go over these quicker than I would in class, but I think you'll get them. The first distinction is between voluntary euthanasia and non-voluntary. Non-voluntary does not mean involuntary. Involuntary here we can rule out, except in cases of like the death penalty. If you believe in the death penalty, you're actually in favor of involuntary euthanasia. That's what the death penalty is. it means you put the person to death against their will. But when we're talking about terminally ill patients, that's terminally ill patients, that's typically off the table. And the distinction is between voluntary, the person is conscious and they're aware, and they make the choice, and they say, look, man, like, give me the pills, give me the prescription. I don't want to go through this suffering anymore. Versus non-voluntary. Non-voluntary is typically when a person is no longer conscious and they're kept alive through extraordinary means, like a feeding tube or a ventilator. And you have to decide, usually their nearest person has to decide whether or not to continue the life-sustaining treatment. That's typically non-voluntary. The person is not capable of making a choice. And non-voluntary versus voluntary can sometimes be expressed this way. Just a second set of distinctions. Passive euthanasia, which is legal just about everywhere. You only have to prove it's in accord with the person's wishes or their best interest. Passive euthanasia, which is pulling the plug, and it just means removing a feeding tube or a ventilator. Your person's on some kind of life support, and you remove the life support. And there can be battles about, are there really no other options? Would the person really want this? Does the family truly best express their wishes, and so forth? But if you can establish all that, it's legal just about everywhere. Less commonly legal is what is sometimes called active euthanasia, where somebody has to actually kill the ill patient. And there are two forms of that. So there's direct, the doctor does it. Again, some people use the term euthanasia only for this, the doctor killing the patient at the patient's request. And indirect, the doctor helps the patient do it herself, and that's assisted death. It used to be called assisted suicide, but suicide for many has a kind of moral connotation that they're trying to avoid. And so frequently the more neutral term assisted death is used. And so we're going to talk kind of narrowly about assisted death. And the reason for that is any place that allows any kind of active euthanasia, it's almost always simply the indirect form, the assisted death. And there's reasons for that. There are a couple of places in Europe, a couple of European countries that do allow direct euthanasia, where the doctor can kill the patient at their request, but not very many. And that hasn't been on the table here. There are several states, 6, 8, or 9 now, I forget what it is, that have allowed indirect active euthanasia, the first being Oregon back in the 90s. But there haven't been anybody trying to introduce direct forms. Okay, so this is the Physician-Assisted Suicide Act in Oregon, and every state that's adopted it, including California, which adopted it a couple years ago, has adopted a form of this particular Death with Dignity Act. Right? California's law is almost identical, and it does have a number of requirements. So here are the only people that can use this law. You got to be 18. You must be an Oregon resident. You can't just go visit Oregon for this. You got to live there. Have a terminal illness with less than 6 months to live. Make 3 requests for a prescription, 1 written and 2 verbal, and have to be 15 days between the requests. It takes a total of 45 days. You really got to think about it. According to the law, the prescribing doctor has to consult another physician, also an expert on this illness, and is required to confirm terminal diagnosis and prognosis, determine the patient is capable and acting voluntarily, refer the patient for counseling if either believes the patient's judgment is impaired in any way by some kind of psychiatric or psychological disorder. And according to the law, the prescribing doctor must inform the patient of alternatives, all the alternatives like hospice care and other forms of palliative care. And they can do nothing to pressure, if they were ever found to these doctors to pressure or encourage the patient to do this, there would be serious legal repercussions, and this is monitored carefully. And as far as we can tell, the best studies, it has not been abused. So the question isn't whether it's been abused, but is it something we want to have? Again, only terminally ill people with very lot of pain, very short amount of time are allowed to use this. And since this came into effect about 23 years ago almost now, a little over 1,000 people, about 1,000 people have used it. And there have been 3,000 or 4,000 people who've been prescribed the prescription. Only about 1,000 used it. And that's in 20 years. So it's not used frequently, but what do we think of it? So I'm going to stick with this assisted suicide model as the most common model in the world and the most defensible. Whether you agree with it or not, it has the strongest case for it. So we'll stick with that, and we'll kind of look at the arguments here. So the question is, do we have a right to take our own lives? And you can have 3 positions, right? Always, sometimes, or never. Always would be whenever you feel like it, I suppose. And sometimes would be under extreme conditions like being terminally ill. Never. Right? Now, very few philosophers or ordinary folks either will say that we always are justified in taking our own lives. So this position is one I'm going to not dig into very much. So the question is, are there extreme circumstances where we do have a right to take our lives, or are we never permitted to take our lives? Now, there's a long debate in the history of philosophy about this, and you can see here's good old Thomas Aquinas there, who has a law against this. I'm not going to say much against this. This is Thomas Aquinas talking about suicide in general, and he gives different reasons for being against suicide. And just to very quickly sum them up, he says, look, suicide goes against the living organism's natural impulse to preserve its being, to stay alive. So it goes against this instinct for self-preservation, which is unnatural. And if you look at his view, right, an action is right if it agrees with our nature, wrong if it goes against it. Well, our nature is self-preservation, and suicide goes against self-preservation. We're naturally social animals, and killing ourselves harms the community, so that's bad as social animals. And finally, he gives a religious reason. God owns our life, and therefore only God can decide when we die, and we would be blasphemous and wrong to play God in taking our own lives. Make of these arguments what you will, they'll come back. These apply to just suicide in general, but they obviously are still going to be relevant to talking about assisted death for the terminally ill. This is an argument that is sometimes given. It's the third argument you saw there with Aquinas, and this is a religious argument. There are, of course, many people who object to assisted death on religious grounds. And the argument, I think, looks something like this. This is very similar to what Thomas Aquinas says. God is the author of life and death. It is blasphemy to play God and take that role on ourselves. In addition, God must have a good reason for us to go through all this pain. Nothing happens in contradistinction to the divine plan. And so we cannot take our own lives, even in the face of terminal and terrible pain. I try to be very respectful of religious arguments, and this is no exception. I understand if this is what somebody's faith compels them to believe and tells them how they ought to act, right? So if a Christian person, for example, says to me, look, I don't believe God wants us to take our own lives, and I believe God has a reason for me suffering and dying in this way. And as a person of faith, I'm going to do that. I have no objection to that. I'm not going to tell a person of faith they must commit assisted death or anything like that. If this is what your faith tells you, I understand. I completely understand. But the problem is we got to talk about the law, not just our personal religious beliefs, and we have separation of church and state. I think we ought to take that very seriously. You can't legislate on the grounds that your God doesn't like it. That isn't how it works. God wants this and God doesn't want that, and so on. So it can work personally, but it can't work legally or socially. So if someone doesn't believe in this God, and they say, I don't see why I don't believe in your God, I don't accept these reasons, this is obviously an argument that isn't going to convince them. And even if they believe in a God, but their conception of God is different than yours, they won't hold on to this. So this argument might work on a personal level, but it can't give us, it can't tell us whether this ought to be legal or not, right? So let's bracket it and say this is a personal issue and not one you can't tell other people how to behave on the basis of our religious beliefs. At least I think so. Okay. David Hume is a philosopher who is very famous, and he comes up in a lot of cases. You can see him here, 1711 to 1776. He basically has a series of arguments against the position that we saw by Thomas Aquinas. And he says, look, it's not a crime against God to take your life in extreme circumstances. And he is talking about extreme circumstances, so he has things like terminal illness in mind. Since to claim only God can decide when we die, we'd also have to maintain that we can do nothing to prolong our lives. So isn't putting somebody on a ventilator or even giving them antibiotics playing God by interfering in the natural processes that would otherwise kill them? If your answer is no, then why is it playing God to end a life slightly early so the person doesn't suffer? Right? You gotta have it. You gotta go both ways here. You can't split it. It's no crime against society. Look, says Hume, we have obligations to others. We ought to care about others. It's very important to care about others for Hume. He bases his ethics on caring about others. But we are not obligated to provide some small benefit to society at the cost of great. If you're dying of pancreatic cancer and you have nothing left but a month of pain, what benefit does it to society could outweigh your personal suffering? That's his argument. And finally, he says, look, it's not an argument against ourselves either, because we are not obligated to keep living when to keep living would just be misery and nothing but pain. So these are your philosophical backgrounds. And if you look at the common arguments you get in the popular press for and against assisted suicide, you get this, right? So there are two arguments for, assisted death, and they're strong, and they're in my opinion, very good arguments. That does not mean that you have to accept them. You just need a really, really good reason not to, if you reject these arguments. So the number one is kind of a libertarian argument. Libertarian, I own myself, I can do whatever I want with myself. And so the argument goes like this: it's patients' right to choose. Right? Patients have a right over their absolute right over their own lives. Actually, modern medical ethics, if you ever took my biomedical ethics class, I would spend a lot of time on this. But for the last 50 years or so, modern medical ethics has increasingly talked about patient autonomy and their right to choose. And it's not up to the physician, it's up to the patient. So patients have an absolute right over their own lives. Legally forbidden assisted death denies them this right. Patients should be allowed assisted death. It's my death. It's my choice. I should be allowed what to do. That's the main argument. And the other argument goes with it, right? These are two different arguments. The Armand Muse objection, if you remember, Armand Muse was the guy who got a willing victim to be killed and eaten. He killed and ate a guy, and the guy was fine with it. Kind of ridiculous, but that's what happened. So Armand Muse, the consensual cannibal, if I have absolute right over my own life and I want to end it because I'm miserable, can I agree to be killed and eaten? Was what Jürgen Brimes did with Armand Muse. Okay. That's the kind of obvious objection to this argument. So just think about that. But the second argument goes with it too. And these go together. It's kind of a utilitarian argument that we should minimize suffering and maximize happiness. But it goes together with the libertarian one here. To force a patient to endure pointless suffering is cruel. To permit a patient to end their suffering is merciful. We ought to be merciful and not cruel. We should allow assisted death. So you just have two arguments, really. Look, man, it's you're respecting the person's autonomy and their own choice, and it's also merciful. You're saying, look, you don't have to suffer to the end. You can choose to die peacefully from a nice prescription, or it's up to you. Right? It's up to you. But the path of least suffering is, in some of these cases, the path of assisted death. Okay? So those are the two arguments for it. It's merciful, the person's suffering, and it's their life, their choice. The arguments against it, let's see how they go. One type of argument is it's just always wrong to kill an innocent person. Euthanasia is therefore murder. You can never kill an innocent person. The only type of killing might be in self-defense or capital punishment or something like that. But no, you cannot kill an innocent person, even if that innocent person is you. And Kant gave this argument. Remember good old Kant? He's a deontologist. He's all about the rules. And Kant says, look, a person must be treated with absolute value. To kill a person, even yourself, is not to treat a person with absolute value. It's to treat a person like a thing. So you can't kill an innocent person, even if that innocent person is you. This argument appeals to some, but it has an obvious flaw. What's more respectful of a person? Giving them the choice of how they go out, of how they exit, or telling them they must suffer? And is it dignified to suffer? And you saw my son walk through the background there. It's obviously a green screen. But anyway, back to the lecture. Is it truly respectful to say, look, I don't care how miserable you are, you're suffering to the end. You don't have the right to take your life. Is that truly respectful? Or would it be more respectful to say you're suffering an awful lot? If you want, there's this prescription and you could die peacefully and the suffering could end. And that's at least debatable. Right? And is it really the same thing as murder? Take your own life when you have a month to live or less? Those are the kind of questions you want to ask with this argument. Another argument is that a doctor must not harm a patient for any reason. That goes all the way back to ancient Greece, right? First, do no harm. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. It seems like most doctors do take this quite seriously, that they are obligated to the welfare and well-being of their patients. You can see this with any medical professional right now during this pandemic. Look at the medical professionals and the effort they're putting into their patients and caring for their patients and doing their job. It is a vow. It's very important. And doctors, since the time of Hippocrates in ancient Greece, have said that vow means you can't kill a patient. And the Hippocratic Oath, originally, the ancient Greek Hippocratic Oath, actually forbade assisted suicide or euthanasia. Okay. But of course, you could have this argument. A doctor's primarily obligated to the well-being of their patient. But who decides the well-being of their patient? The patient or the doctor. Medical ethics for the last 50 years or so has leaned increasingly towards the patient decides what's in their best interest, and the doctor must oblige. If that's true, when the patient decides, I want to die rather than suffer through this terminal illness to the end, it would seem you could argue that doing no harm means respecting the patient's choice, whereas not respecting their choice would actually be harming them. So this isn't necessarily a knockdown argument either. Okay. This particular case is extremely important, and I want to see what else I've got here. Okay. Interestingly enough, doctors are allowed to let you die. They can turn off life-saving equipment at your request. If you need kidney dialysis or chemotherapy and you're an adult and you refuse, doctor can't make you do it. You could even, at the end of someone's life, load them up with morphine. This hastens their death, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is to treat the pain. So even though they die faster, it treats the pain. Doctors are allowed to do all that. Passive euthanasia is allowed. On the grounds, it seems, and this is true for the American Medical Association, on the grounds that there's a fundamental and massive difference between killing and allowing to die. So recall this particular phase. This is from one of the authors in your book, James Rachels. I believe it's one of the chapters you've read. I may be wrong. I've got to relook at that, but it is by your author, James Rachel. You at least read that author. So recall, we have two guys here, Smith and Jones. And philosophers always use these terms. They're very uncreative. If there's three guys, they'll sometimes even say Smith, Jones, and another guy. Sometimes if they get really inventive, they'll say Smith, Jones, and Brown. Not very clever, but oh well. So both Smith and Jones stand to gain if they're 6-year-old. They both have a 6-year-old cousin. If that cousin dies, somehow they inherit a fortune. So Smith sneaks in while his cousin is bathing and drowns him in the tub. Awful guy. He should be punished to the severest extent of the law. But here's the rub. Jones is planning to do the same, but sneaks in to find his cousin drowning all on his own. He stands ready to drown the child if need be. The child drowns without Jones having to lift a finger. Is Jones any less guilty than Smith? No, right? Their motive, kill the nephew, inherit the fortune, is exactly the same. The outcome, so not the nephew, the cousin. The outcome is the cousin dies, right? And their character is greed. They're greedy. These are greedy guys, and they've got greedy traits here, and that's that. Right? They're greedy. They want the money, and they're willing to kill the kid. But Jones simply let him die, whereas Smith actively killed him. But there's no moral distinction. It depends on your intention, your motive, and character, or some combination of those. And if you think of it this way, the doctor who says, this guy is very near the end, let's turn off the machines and load him full of morphine, is motivated by compassion. And if I don't want him to suffer any longer, he has to. And the outcome is the guy dies sooner. That's exactly the same motivation, exactly the same outcome. If the guy says, I don't want to suffer anymore, give me a prescription, I'll take it. So that's basically Rachel's argument, and it's pretty good. Okay. So it doesn't seem to me that these arguments that the doctor shouldn't harm the patient or that murder is always wrong actually forbid assisted death. You might disagree with me, but that's just my own take on it. There is this worry about dangerous precedent. You got to learn a little bit about Jack Kevorkian for that. I'm going to send you a separate video that goes into this argument and with Jack Kevorkian there, but it kind of goes like this. This is the worry. If we allow assisted suicide for the terminally ill, what's next? Perhaps we allow the chronically ill, but non-terminal, to take their own lives. Perhaps we'll allow the doctor to actually kill the person, and they might abuse that. Perhaps will allow the clinically depressed to take their lives, to disable the undesirables. Oh, look, I have no fingers. The undesirables. Now, this is perhaps what they call in logic the fallacy of slippery slope, where you unreasonably think some drastic consequences are going to follow if you allow X, Y, or Z. We'd have to look at the data. In Oregon, where we've now had this for nearly 23 years, none of this, 2 through 4 haven't happened. And this is true in most places that have legalized it. However, there are some European countries where 2 and 3 have been allowed, chronically ill, and Sweden, Belgium, I think the Netherlands too. There's a handful of countries that do allow it, 2 and 3. And if you really don't like those, you really don't like that. But there's no reason to believe 2 and 3 must follow number 1. No reason to believe that. But that could be a worry. Number 4, the clinically depressed, that might be a legitimate worry in certain countries that have allowed 2 and even 3. The disabled against their will is, I guess, the worry here. And that hasn't happened in any of these countries that have allowed it so far. Undesirables, that's like sort of a Nazi euthanizing project. And you can always tell an argument's a slippery slope when you get to undesirables, and you get to Nazis. They usually end with the Nazis. That's your first clue. Suffice it to say, I think you can allow one without the others, and that each step doesn't entail the following steps. So if you allowed 1 and 2, do you have to allow 3? Not necessarily. If you allow 1 through 3, do you got to get through 4? Not necessarily. So in each step the next step isn't obvious or necessary. There's another argument though, and I do think this one is an important one to consider. So it's called the value of life argument, and basically the argument is this: life has meaning and value even up to its last moment. And I have a lot of sympathy with that claim. I think that's true. Okay, life has meaning and value even in the face of awful suffering. I think that's true too. Psychologist Viktor Frankl wrote an entire book on this called Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl was a concentration camp survivor, victim of the Holocaust, and he affirmed that even in Auschwitz, he found meaning and value in something to live for. So 1 and 2 are definitely powerfully true. Premise 3, the most important thing in life is the meaning we find in it and the value we gain. Well, there are entire theories of psychology based on this, several of them, and it can be powerfully defended. Powerfully defended. So premise 1 and 2 and 3 all seem to. The conclusion, however, we would be wrong to prematurely deprive ourselves and those around us of the meaning and value of our lives. Seems right. Seems like a great argument, and it is. The only question is, if what you're looking forward to is being unconscious, put in a coma, loaded on morphine and out of it, or racked with such miserable pain it's not worth anything, you can't feel any of the pain, is that truly meaningful? So sure, in most circumstances, this is all true, but the case of somebody suffering with a really particularly nasty terminal illness, are their last days or weeks really going to be so meaningful? Is that really true? And we'd have to look at data and read research and accounts, read what hospice workers have to say, and doctors and nurses and people who work with the dying, and see what they think about that. Okay, so these are the arguments. Now, I'm going to stop sharing the video here for a minute. And what I'm going to do is you'll take this video and the PowerPoint called Assisted Death on your WordPress page. And you will also get a video, New York Times retro report on this, and I think one other video. And the discussion will involve the videos. And the discussion is basically, let me do 5-6 days from now. And what the discussion is going to ask you to do is propound what you think is the best argument against this assisted death and the best argument for it, and then to take kind of a stand. Which argument do you think is better and why? But there'll be some more details with that. So I'll have that soon, and I'll be in touch again soon. Let's take a quick look at our syllabus here, and see if I've go back to this. Just want to double check. So, yeah, Sandel chapter 10. I will have some material either the 24th or the 27th. And by the 27th, which is what day of the week is that? Let me see here. My days, this may have happened to a lot of you as well, that my days are just kind of blurring. Oh, Monday the 27th. So we'll be in touch again soon, and you'll get this soon. And get back to my camera here. I hope you're all well. Be safe. And don't worry too much about your classes. We're all going to be as flexible and as lenient as we can here, and or at least my class. I can only speak for my class. And but do pay attention and do try to get your work done best you can. But most importantly, take care of yourself, be safe, and be well.